Reverend J.C. Smith grew up in rural Alabama. I think he was born around 1930, right around the height of the Depression. His parents were sharecroppers, and to make a living, they were lucky enough to have a mule to till the fields. They lived off of what they grew, some pigs and chickens, and if they were lucky, and they had a good shot, they supplemented their diet with squirrel and possum. He leaves the rural South looking for something better, moves to the big city, moves to Montgomery, Alabama. And in the mid-50s, a now famous woman named Rosa Parks decided that, I think this was an organized decision, but she refused to yield her seat to a white driver. The black people were supposed to go to the rear of the bus. And she refused to yield, and this set off a 381-day boycott. Approximately 40,000 African-American patrons of the Montgomery bus system refused to ride the buses in protest of segregated seating. And they would not bend. The boycott was successful. It lasted for 13 months. And the case went to court. And during those 13 months, Reverend J.C. Smith became one of the many, many volunteers who used their private cars, their personal cars, to give rides to the domestic workers of Montgomery, to students who were trying to get to school, to factory workers, all the African Americans who refused to step on a public bus were helped by people like Reverend Davis, who donated their time, their gasoline, their tires to enable people to get to their destinations without using that public bus system. And this small army of car drivers who helped them played key roles in this protest. They formed Reverend Smith and other people in Montgomery founded the Montgomery Improvement Association, and as their leader, they elected a young, up-and-coming minister called the Reverend Martin Luther King. And Reverend Smith told people that he was an incredibly captivating orator, that his speeches would just sweep you away. You couldn't not listen. So during these 13 months, Reverend Smith and the other drivers kept the people moving, mobile, and able to get to their destinations. And finally, after 381 days, the courts decided that segregated seating, segregated public transportation was unconstitutional. And then Reverend Smith was one of the first riders who stepped on the bus and sat at the front of the bus. And he said, quote, "It felt great. It felt great." In an interview with WGN TV in Chicago, he said, "I didn't know it felt so good sitting up there." After the Montgomery bus boycott, he wound up settling in Chicago, where he had relatives. Chicago was a very popular destination in the Great Migration of rural African Americans who moved north seeking better opportunities. So he was one of those people, and he settled here. He wound up establishing a church in Harvey, Illinois, a Chicago suburb, and became a very, very respected, venerated church leader. And with his death, you know, he's one of the last people, one of that increasingly dwindling group of people who were there, one of those pillars of the civil rights movement. There's a famous photo of Reverend Martin Luther King and his wife, Coretta Scott King, celebrating after a court victory in the Montgomery bus boycott. And Reverend J.C. Smith, who the Sun-Times profiled in an obituary recently, he's in that photo. You can see his face right above Coretta Scott King. And this is a man who really, you know, potentially was putting his life on the line. I'd say possibly was putting his safety on the line. and in those days, potentially putting his life on the line for participating and supporting this protest. And here he walked among us, a reverend at a local church. He was there, as the old newsreels used to say. And he and other drivers, they were persecuted, they were pressured with trumped-up charges. At one point, he was arrested and accused of spinning his tires' wheels on wet pavement, which was illegal. He said he wasn't afraid. He said he knew if it went to court, there was nothing to it. And we found a photograph of him in the Digital Civil Rights Library at the University of Georgia. And there he is holding up his prisoner number, dressed in a beautiful suit, looking very unmovable, very firm, very committed. And so this is a man who had a somewhat quiet life in Chicago, raised his family, took care of his flock at church, but had this incredible chapter of his life when participation in the civil rights movement in the Deep South could be a very dangerous thing for African Americans. So that's the story of Reverend J.C. Smith, who we wrote about recently. 381-day protest, and the white establishment in Montgomery tried to break this boycott, but didn't work. Thousands of people worked together and ultimately prevailed. And it was one of those events that helped propel the civil rights movement forward. One night, they were meeting at a church in Montgomery, and the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, gathered outside. And Reverend Martin Luther King said to the people inside the church, "We can't leave. Nobody's going to leave. The Klan surrounded the church. It could be dangerous." And so the threats were very real then. It was a different time, and but he and others were unmoved. And he died October 12 at 86 years old at his home in suburban Chicago. And this was a man who came from very, very simple, modest beginnings, and yet he instilled in his children that education was the way to move forward and better themselves. And so, Tom, his children and his grandchildren have gone on to earn multiple degrees, bachelor and graduate degrees, from places like Carnegie Mellon, the Juilliard School, Sarah Lawrence, Princeton University, Morehouse, Mount Holyoke, the University of Michigan, Spelman, Washington University. So it's a success story, isn't it?
This was a great story. I had never heard it told like that. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing this story with me. I never knew this about Reverend J.C. Smith, and it was really great, and I listened to every bit. Thanks for sharing again.